international webinar on anti-caste politics and environmental justice, Chapter 6. At the outset, I'm happy to inform you all that our Union College is celebrating its Golden Jubilee this year. On behalf of our college, we congratulate all the stakeholders. Ambedkar Study Center of our college, in association with Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center ARPC, American University, Washington, D.C., USA, is organizing an international webinar on anti-caste politics and environmental justice, Chapter 6. Now I request Professor N.S. Satish Sir, Principal, Seshadripuram Evening Degree College, to render words of gratitude. Over to you, sir.
Good evening to India and good morning to US and UK. I would like to take this opportunity to render the token of gratitude in the 6th chapter, as this is the concluding chapter of international webinar series on anti-caste politics and environmental justice. At the outset, I must thank Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, American University, Washington, D.C., USA, and Ashoka University, Haryana, India, for joining our Ambedkar Study Center. I would like to acknowledge our sincere thanks to two intellectuals who have given the real shape to this series, and for the constant support, Dr. Malini Ranganathan, Director, Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, American University, Washington, D.C., USA, and Dr. Mukul Sharma, Professor, Ashoka University, Haryana. Thank you, Madam, and thank you, Sir. We have conducted Chapter 1 on 14 September 2020, where Nadoja Dr. Wooday Krishna, President Karnataka Gandhi Smaraka Nidhi, Bengaluru, India, and Honorary General Secretary Seshadripuram Education Trust, Bengaluru, had graced the occasion. Professor Ravi Verma Kumar, Retired Advocate General, High Court of Karnataka, India, who had rendered the keynote address. Team speakers were Dr. Mukul Sharma and Dr. Malini Ranganathan. The second chapter was on 19th October 2020. Thomas Cowley, Rutgers University, New Jersey, USA, and Dr. Mukul Sharma were the theme speakers. Dr. Malini Ranganathan had presided the webinar. The third chapter was on 19th November 2020. Dr. Goldie M. George, activist, author, academician, and Dr. Prashant Tambe, founder secretary of Sankalp Society Entrepreneur, were the team speakers. Mukul Sharma sir had chaired the session. The fourth chapter was on 19 December 2020. Professor Asadoran, Professor Anthropology, Australian National University, Canberra, Australia, and Professor Ambika Ayyadurai, Assistant Professor, Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Gandhinagar, India, were the theme speakers. Dr. Malini Ranganathan had chaired the session. The fifth chapter was on 19th January 2021. Kenneth Bro Nielsen, Associate Professor, Social Anthropology, University of Oslo, Norway, and Dr. Basudev Sunani, an award-winning writer of Odisha, Deputy Commissioner of Ministry of Animal and Husbandry and Dairying, Government of India, were the theme speakers. Dr. Mukul Sharma is chaired the session. Once again, I thank Dr. Malini Ranganathan and Dr. Mukul Sharma, who are the real pillars of this series, and for their continued support, and all the theme speakers who have accepted our invite and joined with us. I must acknowledge the constant work of coordinator in the smooth going of the series, that is Mr. Darappa Konnur.
Good evening to one and all. I take this opportunity to welcome all for this international webinar in association with Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, American University, Washington, D.C., USA. At the outset, I would like to thank all the office bearers of this esteemed institution and welcome all of them. Now, I would like to introduce and welcome Dr. Srilata Sircar, who is rendering a theme address. Madam is a lecturer in India and Global Affairs at King's India Institute, King's College, London. Her research interests lie at the intersection of post-colonial urbanism, feminist geography, and the political economy of development. In her doctoral thesis, she explored the phenomenon of subaltern urbanization in the state of West Bengal, demonstrating that agrarian change and the proliferation of rural towns takes place through the entrenchment of existing caste and gender relations. Her work has been published in leading journals such as Geoforum and Gender, Place and Culture. In her postdoctoral work, she has looked at the politics of infrastructure in India's small smart cities. Her current research seeks to trace the historical geography of caste in the Indian Ocean world. She is interested in building theoretical synergies between anti-caste, anti-race, and anti-colonial scholarship. She is the host and convener of the Confronting Caste podcast and seminar series. In this talk, she will present preliminary ideas from a working paper on caste and coloniality in the political ecology of Kolkata. Madam, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I welcome you for this webinar. Welcome. Further, I would like to introduce and welcome another theme speaker, Dr. Prakash Kashwan, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Connecticut, USA, and Coordinator, Research Program on Economic and Social Rights, Human Rights Institute. Sir is the author of Democracy in the Woods, Environment Conservation and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico. He is a member of the Global Expert Group of Scoping of Transformative Change Assessment by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a senior research fellow of the Earth System Governance Project, an external faculty affiliate of a Austin workshop, and a co-editor of the journal Environmental Politics. He has contributed popular commentaries to the Conservation, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Africa is a Country, Hindustan Times, and The Wire, among others. He also co-convenes Climate Justice Network. Sir, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I wholeheartedly welcome you for this webinar. Welcome, sir. I'm happy to introduce and welcome one more guest who is presiding over the webinar, Dr. Malini Ranganathan, Director, Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, American University, Washington, D.C., USA. She serves as the Interim Faculty Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center and is an Associate Professor at American University. She is a critical urban geographer with a broad interest in environmental justice and global anti-racist and decolonial politics. She draws on history, ethnography, and critical mapping to study the struggles surrounding urban water and sanitation, land and housing, and flooding and climate change vulnerability in India and the US. She is especially interested in the relationship between histories of racialized segregation and property law and contemporary environmental inequalities shaped by race, caste, gender, and class. She is currently working on a book project, Outcast City, focused on the making of property, ecology, and subaltern others in colonial and contemporary Bengaluru, India. She investigates environmental racism in America and has studied and spoken on NPR on climate justice in Washington, D.C. Madam, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I welcome you for this webinar and request you to preside over the webinar. Further, I would like to introduce and welcome today's guest of honor, Dr. Mukul Sharma, Professor, Ashoka University, Haryana. Sir is a professor of environmental studies at Ashoka University. Before this, he was the professor and head, Department of Development Communication and Dean Academics at the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, New Delhi. Since 1984, he has worked in academic, development, and media sectors. He has published 16 books and booklets in English and Hindi, the latest being Dalit Aur Prakriti, Jati Aur Bharatiya Paryavaran Andolan, Caste and Nature, Dalits and Indian Environmental Politics, Green and Saffron, Hindu Nationalism and Indian Environmental Politics, and Human Rights in a Globalized World, an Indian Diary. He has been a research fellow in several universities and institutions, including Mahidol University, Bangkok, United States Institute of Peace, Washington, D.C., Safis Scholar, International Institute of Social History, the Netherlands, London School of Economic and Political Science, and University of Oxford. Mukul sir worked as a special correspondent in Navbharat Times, Delhi, and received 12 national, international awards for his environmental, rural, and human rights journalism. Sir, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I welcome you for this webinar. I would like to welcome our beloved Principal Sir, Professor N.S. Satish. Welcome, sir. I welcome all the office bearers and trustees of Seshadripuram Educational Trust and all the principals of our sister institutions, other heads of the institutions, conveners, volunteers, and all participants who have registered across the globe. Now I welcome Sunil Kumarji, Coordinator, IQAC. And finally, I welcome our own teaching and administrative faculties to this webinar. Thank you, one and all.
Respected all the 5 videos of previous chapters are being posted on YouTube. For your reference, our team now has posted the links of the previous 5 chapters in the chat box. I now request Dr. Srilata Sircar, lecturer in India and Global Affairs, King's India Institute, King's College, London, United Kingdom, to render theme talk on caste and coloniality in urban political ecology, notes from a dying metropolis. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you to Professor Kunur for the very warm welcome and introduction. And thank you to Dr. Sharma and Dr. Ranganathan for inviting me to be part of this very impressive lineup of speakers that you have had as part of this series. And I'm very, very happy to be here today with all of you. And I look forward to your comments and questions as well. I'm going to start my screen share so that you're able to look at my So my aim in this presentation today will be to put forward an understanding of what it means to center anti-caste politics within the growing field of study that is urban political ecology, which is also a field that is both reliant on and contributing to the praxis of environmental justice. I'm going to build my argument in 3 parts. In the first part, I will present a very brief overview of what urban political ecology consists of and how caste as a power structure relates to the main concerns and questions of this field of study. In the second part, I will discuss the complexity of the relationship between anti-caste politics and the idea of decoloniality. And finally, in the third part, I will use these theoretical tools to look at the case study of Calcutta, Kolkata, and summarize my argument on what an anti-caste political ecology of the city would reveal to us. So before going into the presentation, I just want to make a note of a few things. The first is about my own caste location. And this is, of course, to acknowledge my caste privilege, but also to contextualize where my analytical standpoint is situated and how it came about. So I grew up in Calcutta in the 1990s under the Left Front regime in a family that is the result of an intercaste relationship. So my parents had an intercaste marriage, and they faced the sort of opposition that usually intercaste marriages do, but it was never articulated as an opposition based on caste, and it was always expressed through the euphemism of class, sophistication, culture, etc. And even though it was an intercaste union, they are both, from quote unquote upper caste. So of course I grew up with immense amount of caste privilege to the extent that it was never mentioned to me, it never featured in public discourse and in family discourse as something to talk about. And it was only later through my engagement with anti-caste literature as an academic and as part of my political understanding of the world that I came to understand the ways in which the understated and unstated ways in which caste operates in society. And that is something that really informs my analytical standpoint as well. So I'm interested in exposing, in visibilizing these understated, unstated ways of operation of power. The second thing is that I'm going to be referring to the city as Calcutta, Kolkata throughout. In 2001, I'm sure many of you are aware, the official name of the city was changed from Calcutta to Kolkata as a step towards de-Anglicization. But as I will show, and as a decolonial perspective would compel me to show, there are clear continuities between colonial Calcutta and post-colonial Kolkata. And that is sort of the point of the presentation. So I'm going to continue to refer to it as Calcutta, Kolkata. The third thing is that I'm going to be using the vocabulary of caste elite and caste subaltern. And this is again to center, the power aspect of it, but also because the places and the communities I'm talking about, there is somewhat a lack of clarity as to, how these communities are classified administratively in terms of OBCs, SCs, STs, but also some amount of lack of knowledge on my part as to whether or not they identify as Dalit or Adivasi or Bahujan. And so to keep the focus on the power aspect of it, I'm going to keep using the vocabulary of caste elite and caste subaltern throughout the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to start by looking at the field of urban political ecology. So urban political ecology has emerged as a subfield of critical urban studies since the 1990s and has steadily grown in terms of its scope as well as its theoretical and analytical arsenal. At its crux, urban political ecology is concerned with the spatial unevenness of the production and impacts of urban environments. It uses the metaphor of urban metabolism to dissect how flows of human labor, circulations of materials, and non-human processes co-construct new spatial formations, some of which come to be designated as urban natures. A bulk of the urban political ecology literature deals with the circulatory infrastructures of water, drainage, and sanitation. And it looks at how these in turn produce spatial and social inequalities. Over the years, the field has had to grapple with specific social structures of inequality, such as gender, race, and sexuality. This means that besides looking at the contemporary production of social and spatial inequality through processes of urban metabolism, the field has also had to reckon with the longer histories of spatial difference created by these institutions of power. And I have here a quote from Nick Heinen, who wrote in 2016 in his review of urban political ecology as a field of study. I want to ask specifically, how can internalizing the deep historical spatial logics of the ghetto, the plantation, the colony, and the reservation push urban political ecology to wrestle with both the racialization of uneven urban environments and also the abolition of white supremacy? So Heinen here is, of course, writing from an understanding of the North American, US-centric sort of social power structure of race. In trying to account for these long histories of inequality, another theme that has emerged as a useful analytic is that of embodiment. Through the idea of embodiment, scholars of urban political ecology have tried to shift the understanding of metabolism from a metaphor to an actually experienced process, both at the level of the individual human body as well as the body politic of the urban. So through the perspective of embodiment, the consumption, waste production, and resource distribution at the level of the city comes to be seen as connected to the bodily experiences of differently situated groups. And despite its decidedly Euro-American roots, as we see in this excerpt from Heinen, urban political ecology has progressively expanded its empirical base, attending to case studies and evidence from across the global South. At the same time, the broadening theoretical scope of the field has led to the emergence of feminist urban political ecology, abolitionist urban political ecology, queer urban political ecology, etc. I argue that it is possible and necessary to constitute an anti-caste urban political ecology. This is, of course, not uncharted territory. Many scholars of urban India, whether or not directly using the language of urban political ecology or speaking to the same literature, have made contributions towards understanding how human nature interactions and environmental politics in urban contexts produce and extend caste-based inequality. Building on that, I argue that the urban political ecology focus on spatiality and embodiment are particularly amenable to understanding the operations of caste power. Caste is an inherently spatial institution of power, and it operates through the governance of access to space. Dr. Ambedkar writes in 1943 in Emancipation of the Untouchables, it is the close-knit association of the untouchables with the Hindus living in the same villages which marks them out as untouchables, and which enables the Hindus to identify them as being untouchables. India is admittedly a land of villages, and so long as the village system provides an easy method of marking out and identifying the untouchables, the untouchable has no escape from untouchability. Based on this, Ambedkar put forward a demand for separate settlements, while also acknowledging that this would most likely be thwarted by the Hindu caste society, as it indeed was. I want to make a note of two things here before moving on to the next part of the presentation. The first is that what Ambedkar has described here and what we know of as the key characteristics of caste oppression in agrarian society may be described as a casteization of space, by which I mean a socially and religiously sanctioned process of demarcating space and governing the use of and access to space through a logic of caste. The second is that the hope placed in the domain of the urban and the liberatory potential of the anonymity provided by the urban has not really been fulfilled in the now almost 80 years since Ambedkar's text was first published. There is ample evidence of this, for example, in studies showing the highly caste homogeneous nature of urban living arrangements in India. In Suryakant Vagmore's critique of Hindu cosmopolitanism, he talks about the workings of caste associations in metropolitan contexts, as well as in the massive overrepresentation of Brahmin Savarna caste groups in formal sector employment and higher education. I want to read into this unfulfilled hope of urban liberation another kind of failure. This is the failure of colonial modernity, or the idea of colonial modernity as a liberatory force. This takes us into the second part of my presentation, which is about the relationship between anti-caste politics and the idea of decoloniality. The idea of coloniality and decoloniality comes from a group of primarily Latin American sociologists and philosophers. I will not go into the details of the intellectual debates around these ideas, but I will define them for the purpose of demonstrating how it is relevant to our discussion of anti-caste politics here. Ramon Grosboguel has described decoloniality as the basis for producing a radical anti-systemic politics that goes beyond identity politics. This, of course, resonates closely with those of us who see anti-caste politics as the means to annihilate a system of oppression rather than to only transform caste identity at an individual level. So from this perspective, even if one self-identifies as casteless or one's caste identity does not exactly fit into the categories given to us by scriptural doctrine, one still remains implicated in caste as a power structure till the time that structure has ceased to exist. So it is in this anti-systemic impetus that we find a resonance between decolonial politics and anti-caste politics. But the relationship between the two is much more complex than just that. And I would go to the extent of arguing that it constitutes, in some ways and forms, a relationship of contradiction. Let me explain why. A core tenet of decolonial thinking is the claim that even though in terms of polities, empires have been decolonized and substituted by post-colonial or settler colonial nation states, the dominant social, political, and economic institutions of today continue to operate based on the logic of colonial rationality. And this is what unifies all contexts globally into a world system of coloniality modernity. The task of decolonial politics then is to de-link from this world system of the colonial modern and build an alternative epistemological foundation to fundamentally restructure our understanding of the human condition. However, our current anti-caste imaginations of what caste justice should look like is very embedded in and reliant on many of these institutions of coloniality modernity. This includes, among other institutions, the carceral state and the knowledge apparatus that was developed through colonial rationality. And herein lies the complexity, and I would go so far as to say the contradiction between anti-caste politics and decolonial politics. I will now try to illustrate this contradiction in further detail by turning to one of the most widely written about tools of colonial knowledge regimes, which is the census. The census is the instrument that has given us many of the categories through which caste is made legible to us today in contemporary India. From the nomenclature of depressed classes in initial rounds of the census operations to the creation of the categories of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe in the 1935 Government of India Act, the census pushes us to read caste through the register of socioeconomic and educational attainments and the resulting idea of backwardness. Now, socioeconomic and educational indicators are, of course, immensely important in understanding the structural features of inequality, but they do not reflect or represent the experience of caste in its entirety and full complexity. For one, it does not give us an indication of how caste power is enforced by those on the caste hierarchy that are not characterized as scheduled or backward. This is one of the first things that Dr. Ambedkar points out in Emancipation of the Untouchables, where he says, the Hindus on their part carried on a campaign that nobody should declare his or her caste in the census return. A particular appeal was made to the untouchables. It was suggested to them that it is the name of the caste that proclaims to the world that they are untouchables. And if they did not declare their caste name, but merely said that they were Hindus, they would be treated just like other Hindus, and nobody would know that they were really untouchables. We see the perpetuation of such a skewed logic even today in the constant opposition and delays to carrying out the caste census for OBCs, even as the demand for it grows from a social justice standpoint. The census as a tool of knowledge production has been critiqued quite substantially in post-colonial scholarship. The established narrative in post-colonial studies is that colonial census operations fixed the categories that used to be fluid. And the census consolidated the place of caste and religion and race in societies to a greater extent than it used to be before. So by and large, the census is presented to us as a mode of imposition of a colonial orientalist ordering gaze onto the native populations. But if we shift the focus from the outcome of the census to its actual operations on the ground, if we shift the focus from analyzing the then there is a different story to be told. And for this story, I'm referring extensively to the work of historian Doipayon Shen. Doipayon Shen has done an in-depth archival investigation of how the 1872 census of the Bengal presidency was conducted. Shen finds in his study that the actual on-ground census operations were carried out through the largely uncompensated labor of several thousand enumerators who represented overwhelmingly the caste subalterns of Bengal, primarily from the groups that are now recognized as Dalit. Furthermore, he finds evidence that these enumerators, who were usually village-level leaders by the name of mandals, took on the task of the census enumeration willingly and enthusiastically, and put themselves through significant amount of physical risk and suffering to carry out the task of enumeration accurately and comprehensively. The census enumerator, despite being an unpaid position, was a highly coveted and competitive one. And once selected to be an enumerator, many of the mandals would frame their letter of appointment and the families would preserve these for generations to come. To give a glimpse of the extent to which the census enumeration process was led and directed by the mandals, according to the data submitted by the Joint Magistrate of the 24 Parganas, which is the district surrounding the city of Calcutta, Kolkata, out of 3,543 mandals who were involved in census enumeration, only 9 were Brahmins and only 4 were Kayasths. Sen finds 2 explanations for this. One, the landowning elite classes or elite castes were simply found to be incapable of the labor required for the work of enumeration, and their direct subsidiaries were found to be not dependable by the colonial administration because of their vested interest in concealing or coloring the census data. But more importantly, the second explanation that Sen gives us is that the opportunity to count and be counted for the census provided the caste subalterns with the respectability and legitimacy that caste society had systematically denied to them. Sen refers to this as indigenous agency. refers to this as indigenous agency in the census and argues that the understanding of the census as a tool of colonial domination must be reconfigured to see it also as a mode of self-expression of the subaltern, and therefore subaltern caste groups be seen as co-creators of colonial modernity. So herein lies the complexity and the contradiction of the relationship between anti-caste and decolonial politics. While colonial modernity makes possible the kind of recognition that traditional caste society did not extend, it also at the same time produces knowledge forms that obfuscate the full understanding of what caste consists of. And so, from a decolonial perspective, if we were to construct an epistemology of caste that is not restricted to empiricist or positivist categories and indicators, we must also be careful to account for the possibilities afforded to the subaltern caste groups by coloniality modernity. So with that, I will now move on to the final part of the presentation, where we look at the urban political ecology of Calcutta, Kolkata from an anti-caste perspective. So for the benefit of those who are joining from abroad and might not be acquainted with the city, Calcutta, Kolkata is a deltaic port city in eastern India. It is the state capital of West Bengal and the third most populous city in the country. The municipal area of Kolkata has a population of about 5 million, with the larger metropolitan area accounting for almost 20 million in total. It is one of the densest cities of the world, with close to 25,000 people per square kilometer. It was the first imperial capital of the British Empire and was first established as a port city in the late 17th century. Before turning to the political ecology aspect of this study, I want to make a few points about the state of knowledge around the city from a decolonial critical urban studies perspective. Despite its prominent position in the contemporary urban landscape, Calcutta, Kolkata has been relegated to secondary status as far as urban knowledge production is concerned, both within the subcontinent and globally. I argue that this is because the post-colonial trajectory of Calcutta, Kolkata does not adhere to the hegemonic narratives of colonial modernity, such as those based in industrial growth, followed by industrial decay, commercial boom, financialization, and neoliberal developmentalism. For instance, the city did not see a burgeoning financial services sector, such as in Mumbai, or a booming IT sector, such as in Bangalore and Hyderabad, or even a manufacturing or tourism-based urban economic flourishing, as we see in many of the second-tier cities of India. As early as 1985, Calcutta, Kolkata was declared to be a dying city by the central government, and it continues to be popularly referred to as an old age home because of this high rate of emigration among local youth to both national and international destinations. Due to this situated nature of its political economy, the city has been relegated to secondary status within the national urban imaginary, despite its prominence in terms of population. Most importantly, the city has remained relevant to migrant workers from the rural hinterlands within West Bengal, as well as to migrant workers from the neighboring states of Bihar, Jharkhand, and Odisha. The reason for this can be located in its relative accessibility, affordability, and the continued existence of microeconomies that are outside of the circuits of global capital, but are still locally and regionally significant. From an urban political ecology perspective, the East Kolkata wetlands receive the most attention, though primarily from a natural sciences and conservation perspective. And the area I'm talking about is the one over here with the red pin. There is, of course, a strong linkage between colonial modernity and the discourse of nature and conservation. I'm sure Dr. Kashwan will elaborate on some of that, so I will not go into the details of it. So I will not go into a decolonial critique of the state of knowledge on the wetlands, but instead I will go straight into thinking about what would it mean to approach the political ecology of the East Kolkata wetlands from an anti-caste perspective. So these wetlands are a collection of 37 mojas or census units in the eastern fringe of the city. They consist of an assemblage of naturally occurring marshland, human-created ponds, fish farms, paddy farms, and built-up area. They cover an area of about 12,500 hectares across several different administrative units in terms of urban local bodies. The area of the wetlands has reportedly shrunk by more than 50% in the past few decades due to the construction of city extensions such as the Salt Lake Township, listed as Bidhannagar here, and the Rajarhat New Town. There are two main sort of elite narratives about the East Calcutta wetlands. The first is that they subsidize the city by providing what is referred to as free ecosystem services. What this means is that in the absence of a sewage treatment plant, all the wastewater from the city is drained into the wetlands. The exposure of this wastewater to sun rays, along with the brackish quality of the wetlands, initiates a process of decomposition that leads to the growth of algae and planktons. These are then used as fish feed or as organic manure, and the water emerges cleaned of waste matter. This process has been widely celebrated in elite planning discourse. The Asian Development Bank, that has been partnering with the municipal corporation for over a decade, has referred to this as a natural sanitation process. Bourgeois environmentalists frequently refer to the wetlands as the kidneys of the city, drawing on the metaphor of urban metabolism. The second narrative is around the caste elite figures who are presented as the lone warriors or saviors fighting for conservation, mainly of the water and the land, but also by extension of the livelihoods of the approximately 50,000 people who work in the wetlands. But in these narratives, what is lost or what is deliberately obfuscated is the fact that this process depends tremendously on the caste labor of fisher folks and farmers who carry out the fishing and farming work that is essential in keeping this ecosystem alive. To understand how this has come to be, we need to look at the wetlands and their relationship to the city in historical perspective. In her recent book, Empire and Ecology, Debjani Bhattacharya has excavated from legal and archival records the conversion of water to land as integral to the making of the urban in Calcutta. She argues that the process of manipulating the deltaic ecology of the place and claiming land from water in however tenuous a fashion were the processes through which the built environment of the city came into being, and a speculative urban land and property market was put in place. An intricate process of legal and bureaucratic maneuver led to the creation of property as she calls it, fictitious capital that formed the foundation of market governance, speculation, and capitalist development. I quote here from Bhattacharya, human intervention managed and radically transformed the slow movements of land and water in and around Calcutta since the turn of the 18th century. The colonial officials harnessed the mobility of the tidal delta, marked by new land formations and subsidence of lands into the river, through what I argue were specific technologies of property. The absence of this historical process from the urban archives of the city is what she refers to as the history of forgetting, which enables the continuing trends in urban development in contemporary times. I argue that the ecological dimensions were not the only aspect of this forgetting. The dynamics of caste and the determining position of caste relations in shaping the built environment of the city are also forgotten in its urban archives. One of the ways in which the urban property market was made accessible only to the colonial elite and to the native caste elites could be kept lucrative was by managing the drainage of the city, especially in light of the plague of the late 1880s. The drainage system of the city was established in 1857, and a part of the wetlands was used for garbage dumping for the first time in 1868. Thereafter, the fisheries were established in the wetlands. The lease for these fisheries remained with an individual named Bhobonath Chen and his descendants for a period of several decades from the 1880s to 1969, when it was taken over by the municipal corporation. Throughout this time, the actual work of fishing and farming has been carried out by caste subaltern groups, including Adivasis and Dalit Muslims, who have been settled here for the express purpose of maintaining this ecosystem. In 2002, the wetlands were recognized as a Ramsar site, which is an international recognition as a wetland of importance, following which the East Calcutta Wetlands Management Authority was established in 2005 for the purpose of conserving and protecting the wetlands. As the city has grown, the wetlands have come to occupy this dual position of being essential to the survival of the city while also being a hindrance to its growth. And this is closely connected to the sensory and affective politics of caste, the kind of caste experience that escapes the dominant mechanisms of knowledge production. For instance, part of the land in the wetlands area is used as a garbage dumping ground where unrecognized and uncompensated waste workers carry out the essential task of sorting and separating solid waste. Due to this, in the elite imagination, the area is associated with foul smells and perceptions of threat and a general stigmatization that is deeply rooted in the Brahmin Savarna caste imaginary. This leads to the ironical situation wherein the very parts of the city that make the urban property market viable in the first place come to be seen as barriers to the expansion of the very same property market. I illustrate this with the following extract from a report in the Times of India dated February 19th, 1996. So this is a report that is talking about the Fresh Kills garbage dump in New York City, which was opened up to tourists as a tourist facility to bring in revenue for the city. And the report says, closer home, things are less hunky-dory in places like Calcutta. The Dhapa dumping grounds on the eastern fringes of the city is no less infamous than Fresh Kills and has inspired many jokes and limericks in Bengali. In fact, they are quite a tourist repellent, and the Chief Minister, Mr. Jyoti Basu, fears them to be an investment repellent too. So at the current moment, Calcutta, Kolkata is facing a literal existential threat as one of the cities most likely to be submerged by rising sea levels by 2050. This threat too affects the wetlands disproportionately more than other built-up parts of the city, placing the people of the wetlands in the dystopian situation where both the growing of the metropolis and the dying of the metropolis will take place at their expense. Based on this very cursory overview of the political ecology of Calcutta, Kolkata and the East Calcutta wetlands, I want to submit the following argument. I argue that while agrarian society may be seen as a process of casteization of space, urban society here is a process of spatialization of caste. The city comes into being not just through the production of space, through turning of water into land, but also through the solidification of caste power in the form of the built environment. The city form itself exists as a spatial articulation of caste domination. So while a conventional urban political ecology would attend to the caste differentiated impacts of urban metabolism and human nature interactions within the city, an explicitly anti-caste urban political ecology would need to account for the caste labor and caste-based extractions that have gone into the making of the built environment itself. And an anti-caste urban political ecology would need to center the epistemic location of the caste subaltern in imagining environmental justice in the city. Thank you so much.
Now I request Dr. Prakash Kashwan, sir, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Connecticut, USA, and Co-Director, Research Program on Economic and Social Rights, Human Rights Institute, to render theme talk on environmental stewardship in an unequal world, insights for environmental and climate justice in India. Over to you, sir.
So thank you everyone for having me as part of this really important series on anti-caste politics and environmental justice. Let me, without actually going into a long round of thank yous, let me collectively thank everybody who's been involved in this series and who's been working to bring together a set of speakers to speak to students at Seshadripuram Evening College. And I took this opportunity to try and speak to a very broad audience. So my presentation will actually not talk about one specific research project or one specific argument, but I wanted to take this opportunity to sort of introduce the field of environmental politics and the associated field of environmental policy conducted from a vantage point of environmental politics. So I seek to demonstrate what it means to take seriously the politics of environment and how it affects the way in which we understand contestation around questions of environmental protection, environmental destructions, and so forth. And as I said, some of the arguments that Dr. Srilata Sircar has made, they are very complementary to what I'm going to say, but the scales are going to be very different. I'm going to take you literally all over the world and also bring down to the grassroots level. But I will talk a lot about policies and politics around policy making. So it's almost like we are talking about two different sides of the same process. And hopefully that will be a fruitful way to sort of conclude these discussions. Just a quick note on the very idea of politics. In many cases, we understand political science as being about parliaments and about elections and all of that. In this context, we understand politics very broadly to mean contestations over resources and over ideas, right? So it is as broad as you can imagine it to be. And the only expectation I have from you in the audience, especially the young audience, is to not have any preconceived ideas about what you're going to hear. So, I often joke at the beginning of my PowerPoints that my research is a bit like a Bollywood movie. You get everything. There's this little bit of song and drama, a little bit of tragedy, and hopefully some moments of sober thinking. So I'll talk very briefly about different ways of thinking about the environment, then use that discussion to draw some arguments about environmental politics. And again, rather than going into the theory, I'm going to demonstrate how environmental politics actually unfolds in the real world. And then we will look at what that means for the processes and outcomes of environmental policymaking before concluding with some insights for environmental and climate justice in India. And then we can all get into a Q&A discussion. Take a moment to look at this picture and think about environment and environmental protection, or nature and nature conservation. So in my rendering, nature is part of the environment, which also includes the atmosphere, pollution, water, and all of that stuff. And by nature, we normally think of as the landscapes and different ways of thinking about landscapes, including, of course, wetlands and water and so forth. So this was the first picture I wanted you to look at. Then look at this second picture and think about questions of environment, nature conservation. I could ask the question, which of these two pictures you associate more closely with nature and nature conservation? And then we could get into a discussion of how different actors understand nature. But I'm going to just give you a third picture, which is not same, although it's from the same region, which shows you wildlife and domestic cattle mixing together. If I wanted, I could have picked up a similar kind of picture from my own homeland back in Rajasthan, showing deers mixing up with sheep and goat herds. And so the point here is that often we think of this as being in contradiction with this. These are the dominant thinking of environmental protection and nature conservation, in which this first scenario does not go with this second scenario. But if you think about the science and the actual functioning of the processes in many different landscapes throughout the world, these two pictures are not in contradiction. And in fact, there is recent research which shows that these landscapes may even be supportive of one another. Cattle grazing and herding need not be in conflict with wildlife conservation. They can actually go together. In many cases, they do contribute to one another. Now look at this picture. So this is sort of another form of this first picture where you see the wildebeest population. Now here you have a bunch of tourists, presumably from Europe and America, surrounding a family of lions. And the way this picture has been clicked, you know that the lions are surrounded from all over. You could also think about similar pictures in Kanha National Park in Madhya Pradesh, where I've done some of my research, and where villagers used to joke that lions are so sick of tourists that they actually run to villages. And so if, stepping back, thinking about the science of wildlife conservation, I think you can appreciate the fact that lion himself or herself actually probably appreciates this picture much more compared to either this picture or this picture. And here you can actually see the diesel fumes of these jeeps directly probably going into the respiratory tract of the lion here. In comparison of these two pictures, if you think about the global community of environmentalists, people who sort of, speak on behalf of nature, most of them would actually fail to identify with the first picture, and they would probably see, even though they make a critical comment about the impacts of tourism, they will come back to say that tourism supports wildlife conservation and cattle herding actually undermines wildlife conservation. Now, in many humanities research, it has been shown very clearly that these are two competing images. The additional argument I'm making here is that even if you were to forget about the sociology of the argument here, the pure science of it also tells us that actually the first scenario is much more conducive to this compared to the second scenario here for the sake of ecology and wildlife conservation. So what does it mean in terms of the larger questions of environmental politics? I will take several examples now, both from United States and India, to demonstrate how these two different views of nature and wildlife conservation operate in practice. So this is a picture from the Yellowstone National Park, which is famous for the wild buffaloes. It has had a long-standing feud with the operators and the customers of snowmobiles. They look like this, and they are essentially a pleasure ride in the winter season, while the environmentalists have argued for a very long time that these snowmobiles are dangerous for the ecosystem and for the wild animals. They continue to operate with quite a bit of success. And rather than sort of talking more about it, I'll read a blurb from a book focused on this, and please pay attention to the language here. It is the world's best known national park, with a controversy that no amount of snow can bury. Rosy-cheeked snowmobilers extol the glories of riding through a winter wonderland, while environmentalists decry the noise, the air pollution, and the harm to wildlife. There seems to be no room for compromise. So remember, there is no compromise between those who are pushing the tourism and the commerce of snowmobile tourism, as opposed to the environmentalists who have long demanded that the snowmobiles be banned in Yellowstone National Park. Now, if you think about the background processes through which this kind of stalemate is actually operating, there is a lobby, there is a constituency behind the operation of snowmobiles, and they have successfully thwarted environmental regulations and wildlife regulations. Despite there being a law about that, they have successfully managed to stand their ground. And in this particular picture, you actually see the Secretary of Interior, which will be comparable to our Minister of Environment and Forest and Climate Change in the center. She actually goes to the park, rides a snowmobile, and then sort of, the picture that you see in the inset, she takes off her helmet and says, I can see the wild animals enjoying their life, and I'm enjoying my life. There's actually no problem. So you see a political leader at the very top of political hierarchy actually advocating on behalf of one constituency. So in this context, you can see that the particular way in which environmental engagement of a particular constituency happen, they have a voice at the very top of the political system. Now you take another example, and this is the North Dakota Access Pipeline. Many of you may have heard of this. There was a massive movement. You see a placard here which talks about protect water and water warriors. And the pipeline was originally supposed to go from another community that you see in the picture on your left here. There's a dotted line on the top which says Dakota Access Pipeline rejected alternative. And this alternative route was going to go through the town of Bismarck, which is has a large majority of white population. All that the white population in this town had to do was to call a bunch of town hall meetings, and they said this project is unacceptable to us. And the project was moved to this red thick line, which goes through the Standing Rock Indian reservations. This second constituency organized protest. They first went through all the same things that the people of Bismarck went through. None of that worked. They petitioned the department. That didn't work. They petitioned the Army Corps of Engineers. That didn't work. They organized massive movements of the type that you see on the right. Even that didn't work. Dogs were brought on, and on and on and on. They had to fight a very, very long time before their argument was heard in the legal process. Now, I want you to remember that there was this law, and there's an entire legal infrastructure where the Standing Rock Indians could actually make their arguments stick, right? So the law, in the end, it did work. Right now, there's a court ban on the operation and the establishment of the pipeline. But they had to raise hell to actually make their arguments heard. And so what I'm saying here is that these are two sort of sides of the same coin. In each of these cases, different kinds of environmental arguments are being brought to bear on an actual political and policy process by different constituencies. And you see that one type of constituencies have had a very easy time with the law and regulations and so forth, while a second type of constituency has had a rough time. And this is actually, because this is all operating within United States, we haven't gotten down to the arguments of global South versus global North, right? This is about how different groups are able to have their way or don't in the political and policy process. This is the crux of environmental politics, where you have competing ideas, competing interests, and competing approaches to thinking about environment and environmental engagement. And they work in very different ways for different groups, because these groups have different kinds of influences and leverages within the political system. I could talk about this other example, but I really need to rush through this discussion now. But there's this innocent looking beavers, most of the times they're very innocent. They were sought to be reintroduced in parts of Scotland and Welsh, and the farmers opposed. And again, in this National Geographic report, you see that the Minister of Environment was speaking on behalf of farmers, and the minister said that it's a very, very difficult issue. So again, there's a constituency, they have their particular way of thinking about the environment and environmental conservation, and their pleas are heard in the political system. Now, take another example, and this is a discussion that has been going on in India for past 15, 20 years, I suppose, but many of you may not have actually heard of this controversy at all, where there's been a long-standing demand that cheetahs be reintroduced in India. Cheetah, as you know, is the fastest running animal on the planet. And it requires a territory of about 1,000 kilometers. Every cheetah must have about 1,000 kilometers of more or less free-ranging land to thrive in the way they're used to thriving in their natural landscapes. Now, India is one of the most densely populated countries, as you know, right? And so there can be absolutely no place for cheetah in contemporary India. If we were thinking about the health of cheetah himself or herself. Again, right? So there is a sociological argument about why it would be problematic to bring the fastest running animal to the densest parts of the world. But I'm saying even the science of it says that cheetah should not be reintroduced because we don't have the kind of habitat that can support a cheetah population, a viable cheetah population in any parts of India. And in fact, at one point in time, Supreme Court asked the advocates of cheetah reintroduction in India, where is your science? And they failed to show any science because a report that the Wildlife Institute of India had done initially actually showed the same argument that it's not going to work. Anyway, long story short, today we have a situation where cheetahs are going to be reintroduced in Kunu Palanpur area in Madhya Pradesh. Now, if you sort of take the 1,000-kilometer territory that I mentioned and draw a line from Kunu Palanpur to 1,000 kilometer, you know where it actually reaches? It goes all the way to Chandigarh. So if to have a viable cheetah territory, you needed a more or less natural landscape between Kunu Palanpur and Chandigarh, which is obviously not the case. Now, you know who's going to pay the cost of cheetah reintroduction. And that's why not just the Supreme Court has rejected pleas against cheetah reintroduction, but more importantly, there has been no public debate in India on this question. It's all between the environmentalists and the Supreme Court and certain officials in the ministry. There have been a few articles in Down to Earth, and there's been very little popular press coverage of the issue. So one, you see how a issue is discussed very different ways, in very different ways. Second, you see that the spaces within which this is discussed is also dramatically limited, right? There is no democratic public debate on this question. So all of these examples demonstrate the ways, I mean, and this is where we come back to some of the arguments that Dr. Sircar was making. It demonstrates how our environmental imagination is colored by a colonial understanding of environment and nature, where primitive people can coexist with nature, but as long as they don't do any animal husbandry or they don't do any agricultural operations, primitive people, quote unquote primitive people, are allowed to coexist with wild animals as long as they behave as wild species. But if they demand agricultural land, such as in the context of Forest Rights Act in India, that is not acceptable. There is an environmentalist, very respected environmentalist by the name of Bitu Segal. He was asked around 2007, 2008, I think, 2007, right, when we celebrated 60 years of India's independence. He was asked, what do you see as the high point and low point of democracy? And he said, the enactment of the Forest Rights Act was the lowest point of Indian democracy. Now, for those of you who don't know Forest Rights Act actually addresses a colonial era problem where the pre-existing land rights of Adivasis and other forest dependent people were made illegal by a colonial map maker. So many forest dependent people and Adivasis actually celebrated Forest Rights Act as their second independence or their real independence, because that's where the rights that the Forest Rights Act gives them allows them to be who they are, allows them to claim their existence as people who are in a direct engagement with and dependent with land, forest, water, and other kinds of resources over which the Forest Rights Act recognizes their right. It recognizes their existence as citizens whose voices are counted in the process and implementation of lawmaking. And that same process was labeled by one environmentalist as the lowest point of Indian democracy. And that, I would argue, is a commentary on the kind of society we are. But again, this is a point that is much broader, and it, as I showed you in other examples, it applies to every country, every place in the world. Colonial legacies of environmentalism have colored our imagination of environment, but more importantly, or equally important, these imaginations shape in very active way, in a very nuts and bolts, very ongoing, routine, everyday way. It shapes how we think about environment, what we do about the environment, and what we don't do about the environment. And this again is the kind of one way in which, if we take the politics of environment seriously, environmental policy making and the debates around environmental policy, they look very different compared to if you were behaving as a technocratic scientist who's thinking about environment as something that can be regulated, that can be governed with the fiat of scientific reports or a law per se. So these comparisons tell us how environmental politics actually operates in the real world. Let's get real quick to the more deeper histories and the way in which political economy of environmental policy making works. And by political economy, I simply mean the politics, understood very broadly, as I described earlier, and the economic interest of the snowmobile operators or of the conservationists who are owners of wildlife tourism resorts, or whose academic work and scientific work is dependent on particular kind of conservation. All of that is part of the political economy which shapes environmental policy making. And we already saw how the colonial imaginations of environment shapes and influences environmental policy making and implementation of environmental policy in different parts of the world. But how do we actually grapple with all of these complexities and bring them together in sort of one nutshell? So this is my attempt to do that, to create a framework which takes the history, the sociology, and the ongoing politics of environmental policy making very, very seriously, while allowing the researchers, especially young researchers, to sort of have a map that can help them make these different connections. Now, some of these kinds of maps are often misused. They are used as if this is our tool to sort of, again, it's like a software that you run and it churns something out. That's not how it is meant. And that's why sometimes I'm very hesitant to show these diagrams. But with this young audience, I wanted to sort of just introduce you to frameworks like this, which can be used to connect the different aspects of these debates that we've talked about. I have used this framework to analyze what determines the extent to which countries protect their land. So the colors that you see here, the most red colors are the colors where countries have the largest percentage of national territory declared as wildlife sanctuaries and national parks and so forth. So these are areas that are meant for protection of nature. And as you see, there is a great deal of variation in different parts of the world. Now, of course, if you were to compare India, if you see my cursor here, that has about 6% of land under conservation, compared to, say, Tanzania, which is here and has about 39% of national territory declared as national parks and wildlife areas. And Tanzania is one of the poorest countries in the world. And when I first show this map, even the people who've been working in Tanzania for many, many, many years, they are shocked to hear that about 40% of country's land is set aside for the goals of wildlife conservation. Now, if you account for these differences of population density, area, economic development, and so forth, what my research shows is that the extent to which countries declare these protected areas is dependent also on the way in which inequality and democracy intersect with one another. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this research and its outcomes, but in a sample of 130 countries, this research shows that more inequality and poor democracy combine together to create an authoritarian, dictatorial wildlife conservation regime. So if you have countries that are like dictatorship, countries where poor people don't have a say in the political system, there you can set up all these large protected areas because you don't care about poor people, simply speaking. But if you have countries with effective, strong democracy and low level of inequality, the citizens there, after a while, they don't allow you to reintroduce the beaver, right? As in England and Welsh. They don't allow you to set up new nature parks, such as here in the United States. So this is one way in which you can actually get at the question of how does the politics of environment work at a macro scale. But this is obviously insufficient and sometimes even non-satisfactory, because you're thinking about countries as one unit. And in doing that, you actually lose all the kind of granular analysis that you saw in Dr. Sircar's analysis. So that is also my position, that sometimes statistical research is not actually good research, or it doesn't tell us a lot of things. In my book, I've compared India, Tanzania, and Mexico, and I have taken a long historical and political economic look at how do societies try to balance or fail to balance the concerns of environmental justice and environmental protection and social justice. So if you intersect the two together, you get environmental justice, right? And again, I'm not going into the details. There's a long history chapter which would resonate with some of the arguments that Dr. Sircar made about colonial census operations and how some local groups were able to make use of the census operations and how elites engaged with the process. Similarly, you could actually see the same processes unfolding in the context of forest conservation and forest governance. The main argument that I make in this book is that the success of countries in balancing environmental protection and social justice is dependent in very significant ways on whether the poorest people have a say in the policymaking process. So I gave you the examples of the beavers, the snowmobilers, the North Dakota water protectors, and the case of cheetah reintroductions. So you understand how the process of intermediation of these different interests takes place in the political process. If a particular group is able to make their voices heard in the political process and in the actual policy-making process, we call it a case of quote unquote successful interest intermediation. And obviously it doesn't happen just through elections. It doesn't happen just through public hearings. It happens through these processes plus a variety of other mechanisms where you can have the masses have some influence either through their representatives or through the court system or through the media system or through the mass movements, either non-violent or in some cases violent mass movements. So there are a variety of ways in which different interest groups can have an influence on the political process, right? Now, conventionally, you think of democracy as being this process as if, democracy means destruction of nature, right? You say, if you open it up to everybody, isn't everybody going to destroy everything? No, actually protection of environment also requires existence of strong democracy. So if you had effective democracy in India, you would not have had a elected government bringing in the environmental impact assessment amendments, literally killing that whole system in the midst of a pandemic. It is not because of democracy that our environment is destroyed, but one could argue that it is actually the opposite. It's actually the lack of substantive functioning democracy which leads to the exploiters of nature and human beings having their say, which leads to both the destruction of environment, violation of people's rights, and violation of the way in which we can fruitfully engage with nature, even though we sometimes have to interfere with natural processes and so forth, right? So the argument is that when you have effective democracies, there is a relatively speaking better kind of balance between environmental concerns and social justice. When you have poor democracies, high inequalities, you have the elite exploiters, the industrialists, the miners, the crony capitalists taking advantage of the system and having their way, while ironically, in many cases, these capitalists will be able to speak at the loudest possible way and sort of show them as be the protectors of environment by doing corporate social responsibility and so forth, while engaging in practices of fossil fuel extractivism, engaging in practices of mineral extractivism, all of which actually create irreparable damage to the environment and to the nature. And then in the book, I also look at how these same processes unfold in the context of policies that are meant to address climate change. And again, we can't go into the details here, but if you compare these kinds of policies between different countries, you can see how first at the global level, framing of these policies is affected by what kind of narratives are popular and what kind of narratives are not accepted in the process of policymaking at the United States, United Nations level. But even when these policies come back to national level, they function in very, very different ways. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. So please don't, every time you hear someone talking about society having to fight climate change, you know, when you hear about arguments about humanity is facing its gravest threat, it is of course facing the gravest threat, but humanity is not united. It never has been, it will never be united in fighting against anything. It is all about which kinds of groups can actually exert some kind of influence in the political process. Now I'll conclude with the last segment of drawing implications for environmental and climate justice. I will switch gears very quickly here to give you a slightly different definition of environment that I think you already seen or heard about in one of the talks earlier. Environmental justice movement defines the environment not just as the kind of nature that I showed you, not just as pollution and pipelines and all that, but environmental justice movement has argued that environment is where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we learn. And of course, nowadays people also add where we struggle, right? So that's environment. It's a very expensive but very rich definition of environment. This is a picture from a recent New York Times report on pollution in Delhi, and how even though Delhi is supposed to be one of the most polluted cities, the cost of environmental pollutions are borne very differently by Monu on the left compared to Amya on the right. So if we take this definition of environment seriously, is what much of the urban India looks like. And this, you know, if you heard Dr. Ranganathan's presentations, her work on water sort of talks about all of this. So climate change intervenes in a world which looks like this, which is full of Monus and Amyas. It looks like this. But most of the times it doesn't look like this, in the sense that climate policymaking does not engage with the people who are affected most seriously by climate change. On the other hand, of course, you know, the policymaking on urban programs in India is all about this: sustainable cities, you know, shiny charts and diagrams. But if you actually look into what's underneath these charts, some of this turns out to be very, very hollow and shallow. But more importantly, if we go back to the idea of environment, where we live, where we work, and some would argue where we go, as in how we dispose our waste and who cleans that up, that's our environment. So in a nutshell, if I were to identify the topmost environment problem, challenge, and also the topmost environmental justice question in India today, that would be our sanitation and the way in which Dalits are exploited in this process, dehumanized in the process. But most of the times, we aren't talking about, except for, when you have scholars like Dr. Ranganathan talking about it, in policymaking and in most of the environmental movements, we don't hear about sanitation as being our number one environmental challenge. And of course, you won't hear about Dalits most of the times. But this really is a large and a kind of problem that have not just it should be addressed immediately, but we should be talking much more about it on a day-to-day basis. But we are not doing that. Now, in this particular picture, you see a woman who's actually got a flush modern toilet at home. But she's forced to clean the community latrines in this kind of a bamboo basket day in and day out because of the way the system is, right? So you think about caste and caste exploitation as being a social problem. But in India, we have this strange system where the system is maintained by a structure of municipal governance, which puts Dalits as the sole caretakers of our waste problem, sole caretakers of our dirt. And this is a picture from Mumbai Municipal Corporation operations. In many cases, these workers are not even paid minimum wages. And of course, in this picture, you see that there are no gloves, there's no mask. And in the other picture that you saw, the person, of course, gets into the manhole and does this sort of manual cleaning. Now, in Mumbai, there's been an interesting long-standing movement of the waste picker and the garbage collectors unions. And they've had a successful case in a sense that they forced the municipal corporation to accept the demand, to accept them as proper employees. They've gone through long battles of fighting it out in the courts and securing some victories. But I want to sort of, talk about this one particular instance in which the Mumbai Municipal Corporation sought to use what was called as Hyderabad pattern. Now, this is a neoliberal model of sort of dealing with the problem of municipal workers. The Hyderabad model means that don't recognize municipal workers as workers, because if you recognize them as workers, you have to pay them minimum wages, you have to pay them social security and so forth. You have to give them leave and so forth. So call them volunteers doing your environmental cleanup. And instead of actually employing these volunteers in municipal roles, you contract this process out to a non-governmental organization. So non-governmental organization doing an environmental cleanup recruits some volunteers, and these volunteers then do this kind of cleaning that you see here. And of course, the unions have fought this process. And it's a very interesting report. Please read it when you have a moment to see how the extent to which poor people have to go to just say the obvious, right? Of course, they are not volunteers. I mean, for God's sake, I mean, didn't you actually think about this entire history of slavery, caste-based slavery before actually even using that word, right? Who would do that? But there are neoliberal logics of policymaking that makes it possible to reframe slavery as volunteer kind of work. And this is pathetic in the sense that, I mean, forget about all of the sciences and critical social science and all of that. That person who first coined this thing, they absolutely had no humanity left them in them. To do this, you have to actually go against your humanity in a very fundamental way. And I want us to be sort of thinking about these issues, because policymaking, as this series has been demonstrating, is not about flashy brochures and flashy reports. It's about these kinds of questions. How do we think about fellow human beings, and how do we situate them in the process of policymaking? So this, I would argue, is the environmental justice question of our society, the environmental justice question of our society. And it's not as if this is just a question of day-to-day operations, and it doesn't have to do anything with climate change and so forth. This is a picture from 2015 after the Chennai flood happened, and you saw lots of pictures of volunteers, actual urban volunteers, coming out and cleaning up Chennai's streets. but the majority of the task of cleaning up, picking up dead carcasses of animals, even dead bodies, sometimes without gloves, was left to the 30,000 Dalit municipal workers who were called from all over the state, and in some cases even from the neighboring states. So climate change brings a society into full view as long as we are willing to look at the right places, right? It sort of acts as a mirror of who we are and how we deal with our fellow Indian citizens or other fellow human beings. That's the question of climate justice. And if you think about environment in a broad way, as the scholars of environmental justice have taught us to do, if you think about environmental policy making, taking the politics of it seriously, then climate change looks like a very different kind of challenge. And it actually fundamentally forces us to think our sort of gradients are the grain of who we are, where the gravity of power lies in our society, and how the avalanche of social inequality buries poor people underneath the kind of disaster that you saw in Uttaranchal recently, or in the floods that we have seen in Chennai and Kerala and so forth. And of course, that's not to say that there's not an international injustice, which of course has been talked about very often, and that's a real question. But while we are fighting the battle to demand international and global climate justice, we should not forget, and thus far we've been actually not only forgetting, we've been sort of sweeping under the carpet these real questions of environmental and climate justice. And I hope that some of you who are taking up your academic enterprises now going forward will come up with research and scholarship that will shape our thinking in newer ways, and which will bring the questions of inequality and power to the center of these discussions. Now, there's an entire discussion of how we can talk about power in the context of policymaking processes at different level, but that I will leave either for the Q&A or maybe another round of conversation. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to engaging in a live discussion.
Now the floor is open for the interaction. As we're running out of time, we take up only few questions which we have received in the chat box. I request Professor Vinay sir to moderate the interaction session.
Thank you, Harsha sir. Good evening to the dignitaries. The first question is for Srilata ma'am. Ma'am, what are the similarities between rural and urban environmental politics?
The question of caste is, I think, one that really connects the two quite fundamentally. The question of power, as Dr. Kashwan has been talking about, that at the essence of it, it's a question of how we treat fellow human beings. And that remains the central question, both, in rural contexts and in urban contexts. Of course, some of the issues like sanitation, specifically like policy issues of sanitation, water supply, etc., they differ in their, the immediate articulation. So in rural areas, for example, the Swachh Bharat scheme, for instance, it has been touted as, really revolutionizing sanitation in rural areas. But I think the caste element of it has really been overlooked, which has almost led to its failure, I would say, in many senses, because it doesn't account for the caste labor that is integral in, keeping sanitation systems going, whether of the modern kind or of the traditional kind. So the articulation of the questions differ from rural to urban, but the questions themselves, I think, remain same. And at the center of it is the question of power, which in the case of India is largely the question of caste, as well as, questions of gender and religion, but very much to a large extent caste. And I think that is the kind of connecting aspect of environmental questions in rural and urban areas.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is to Dr. Prakash, sir. How environmental justice depends on caste, racism, and colonial system?
Thank you for that wonderful question. I think it's a very big question in the sense that um, as we in both the presentations we talked about different aspects of environment, and each of those different aspects of the environment would bring up different kinds of environmental justice questions. I mean, if you're thinking specifically about the wetlands, for example, as opposed to forest or sanitation or climate change or wildlife conservation, right? So each of these environmental questions will bring up a specific kind of environmental justice question. And the influence of colonialism or colonial legacy again comes into this discussion in a variety of ways. It comes into this discussion in the way in which we have thought about questions of caste and its meanings for our everyday social functions and economic functions. But it also comes into the picture in the ways in which we think about the environment, right? So we talked about how thinking about pristine nature, where you only see animals and trees, right? And this is so funny, actually. I was going to talk about Africa, but let's talk about Karnataka. There was this movie documentary that was recently made, Wild Karnataka, and the world famous documentary Sir David Attenborough gave commentary for that. That movie completely wiped the Adivasis and other forest dependent people out of that documentary, as if there are no people in wild Karnataka. I mean, there is no wild Karnataka without the Adivasis, because they have actually nurtured the landscape, right? So colonial imagination, as well as the colonial influence of people like Sir David Attenborough, actively erases people out of these pictures, and so creates a fundamental environmental injustice by not just not letting them have any voice in the system, but simply physically, literally taking them out of the picture, right? And similarly, Dr. Sircar talked about the wetlands and how some people are taken out of that discussion. So these are all the different ways in which colonial and inequalities come into the discussions of environmental justice and injustices.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thanks for allowing me to ask this question directly. I was thinking about how do I send it to Dr. Satish so that he will add it to the questions list. Brilliant presentations and very impactful presentations by both the speakers. My question is for Dr. Prakash. I would like to congratulate him for using those very, very impactful pictures, actually. Those pictures of sanitation workers from Mumbai, very impactful, actually. Dr. Prakash, when we talk about this impact of climate change on communities in India, so community is considered as a whole, as a block, you look at it. But my question is, but then within the community, there are various vulnerable groups like tribals and Dalits who are not so prepared, and their resilience would vary across the community. So how the climate change would impact these vulnerable sections of the communities? Thank you, Dr. Prakash.
Thank you, Prashant Thambe ji, for that wonderful question. You're right. I mean, there are inequalities along the lines of gender, caste, religion, class, education, right? All of those inequalities affect the extent to which different people are affected by climate change. Last year, there were these floods in Bihar, and the journalist from BBC went to visit these areas, and they found people sleeping in tents where, because it was flooded, there were snakes crawling all over, and people were, they didn't have secured place to sleep at night, right? So those are one type of vulnerabilities that an urban middle class person would never think of, right? So for them, it might be If their locality is flooded, maybe they, just to be sure, they go to a friend's place and sleep there. Or maybe their work is disrupted for a few days. But for many people, in fact, in 2017, there were these large floods in parts of North India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. 40 million people, which is like 4 crore people, were displaced for weeks. And they were, grappling with the questions of food, shelter, water, medicine, and so forth, right? So, of course, all of those dimensions affect how communities are affected differently by the ongoing climate crisis. I do want to say that as we think about communities organizing against these very real injustices, environmental injustices or climate injustices, there are some really difficult questions that we need to grapple of inequality, not just between, say, Adivasis and caste society and Dalits and non-Dalits, but also, the way in which poverty intersects with the questions of Dalit or Adivasi marginalization. I'll just give you a very quick example. I was doing field research in Jaipur, and there the Jaipur Municipal Corporation allowed Brahmins to apply for municipal jobs. And they got some Brahmins they recruited some Brahmins to do municipal jobs. And Brahmins were able to hire other Dalits to do their job. So they were taking the salary and subcontracting their actual work to Dalits. At one point in time, I think the municipal corporation came out with this regulation that if you took up a job, you have to do it. You have to get into the manhole if you took a job which requires you to get into the manhole. So if you think about this, I mean, on the one hand, we demand that, no human being should be getting into a manhole. Why can't we can go to the Mars? We can't get machines to clean our sewer system, right? But on the other hand, if you think about these kinds of discriminations between Dalits and non-Dalits, Dalits in that case were actually demanding that these jobs should be secured only for Dalits and they should not be given to non-Dalits, right? So the point is that as a society, we have some very difficult questions to answer, because who should do any of these jobs is not an easy question because of the level of poverty that we have. So in that sense, economic questions comes back to intersect with the questions of social justice and, of course, the questions of environmental and climate justice. I hope it opens up the discussion, if not fully answers your question.
Now I request Dr. Malini Ranganathan, Director, Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, American University, Washington, D.C., USA, to give away the presidential remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Elargu namaskara. Thank you so much to Professor Satish, Mr. Konur, and Professor Sharma in being my comrades in organizing this series over the last several months. To me, there has been incredible power in bringing together the concerns of anti-casteism, anti-racism, and housing them within the incredibly important Ambedkar Study Center at Seshadripuram Evening Degree College. So this multi-continental initiative, I think, is symbolic for me in terms of the power and potential of solidarity and intellectual solidarity. So thank you all. Thank you very much to our two speakers today, Dr. Sircar and Dr. Kashwan. I think it's very fitting that we ended this series with these two talks. Because if I was to pull out one thread that connected these two talks, it would be this. Forget for a second about ecology, forget about environment, forget about sustainability. At core, this is about humanity. And we will not achieve sustainability or ecological justice unless we center the imperative of humanity. And we must reclaim humanity against the vices of caste and untouchability. And it is in this endeavor, I think, in this spirit, both through activism as well as intellectual pursuits, and of course through policy as well, that I think we can achieve a sustainable and more livable and humane world. And so I think for me, the centering of the imperative of humanity is a very key aspect of both these talks and indeed our entire series. So since we are well past time, I'm going to really just ask two questions of each of the speakers and then close there. Two questions that I think each provoke further thinking, research on these topics. So with Dr. Sircar's talk, one thing that really struck me is how she used the case of Kolkata's wetlands to really think through how the transformation of water to land has erased caste geographies in the city, and in particular the labor of Dalits. The very Dalit laborers that transformed the land and conjured land from water are now the ones who are also being criminalized and denigrated. Their personhood, their humanity denied and considered not worthy of the very property they created. I think this is a really important provocation for us to think through all across India as well. To Dr. Sircar, I have two questions. One is, you're doing a really important endeavor here in rethinking urban political ecology. And you've given us much to think about in terms of the relationship between coloniality and anti-caste politics, a quite contradictory relationship and by no means clear-cut. But what is the relationship between anti-caste politics and Marxist critiques of the city? As you know, much of urban political ecology was born out of Marxist theory and Marxist geography, particularly the centering of class and dispossession in urban processes, accumulation by dispossession. So given, again, a tense relationship historically between Marxist activists and Dalit activists, right? I think this is going to be a key thread for you to continue to look at in your work. The second question for Dr. Sircar is that Dr. Kashwan talked about the Hyderabad model in terms of Safai Karmcharis, in North India, Paura Karmikas in Southern India. And I myself, together with Isaac Arul Selva, who is a journalist and activist in Bangalore, have been looking at this increasing precariousness of Paura Karmikas in Bangalore as well, right? What is the neoliberal policy that is creating more precarity for Paura Karmika laborers, for sanitation workers? So have you seen this also happening in the case of Kolkata, right? And conversely, in terms of resistance, have these sanitation workers tried to fight back against this increasing precarity? Have they centered their own labor in terms of cleaning the city as a means to resist these types of policies? At one point in Bengaluru, as you know, the workers stopped cleaning the city, and so there was a pileup of garbage. To me, that's a direct kind of stoppage of metabolism, but also the visibilization of Dalit labor. Unless they're doing the work, right? If they stop doing the work, we actually realize how important their work is, right? So is there that type of politics going on in Kolkata as well? For Dr. Kashwan, I really enjoyed the way you pivoted from a macro analysis of the politics of environmental conservation and the kind of erasure of human presence in typical imaginaries of nature as being pristine, and how you pivoted again to centering humanity in concerns around environmental justice, both I think in rural and urban India. You spoke about the erosion of democracy, but you did not speak about the role of Hindutva and Hindu nationalism in these types of conservation imaginaries. I am curious, Dr. Kashwan, as to the role of Hindu nationalism in the kind of perpetuation of the erasure of particular people in particular environments, and if this is something that you've looked at all. Finally, I'm curious, and this is a question to both of you, when we move from the macro to the micro, then suddenly we start talking about caste and untouchability. But can we actually use caste as a global framing to think about environmental injustices in the world, as some scholars have now started to do from the North American vantage? And what kind of analytical purchase might caste, might untouchability, might the kind of structural inequalities that we see in India actually have for thinking about injustices more globally? And so this is a kind of analytical question for all of us, I think. And there I'll end. Again, my huge thanks to all of you for participating in this series, to all the participants who registered, and especially to my comrades who helped organize these series. Thank you.
Now I request our guest of honor, Dr. Mukul Sharma ji, Professor, Ashoka University, Haryana, to address the gathering.
Thank you, Mr. Harsha. We all know that our near dear principal is so particular about time, when to start and when to end. So I will not take much. Again, it's a concluding session of our international series on anti-caste politics and environmental justice. So, like Malini and Professor Satish both said, we are extremely happy to come to this stage of Chapter 6, when, in a way, we are concluding this series. Of course, we will continue this work somehow, collectively, individually. We will think about some publication out of this series. I, for example, Mr. Satish, will always be ready to come to Seshadripuram College and teach a course on environmental justice or environmental politics for a month or so, entirely pro bono. So anytime, especially when I'm not teaching in Ashoka University. So this has been so overwhelming since the past, I think, 6 months of this series, and preparing for this series for 1 or 2 months, so 7, 8 months. So I'm sure many of you also must have felt energized and active the way I do. So my sincere thanks on behalf of Malini and me both, the college and the entire leadership team, Dr. Krishna, Professor Satish, Dharappa Kanur, Sunil Kumar, Professor CL, and many students representative. They are all very remarkable, very solid, so enthusiastic and positive about things. Actually, what Malini was saying, actually, I will say in different words. In fact, they symbolize some of the best traditions of academic democracy: debate, difference, dissent. That is why we could think and conclude such a politically vibrant series in a college. And that also when they are celebrating their golden jubilee year. This is rare a time. This is really rare. When we know how Disha Ravi, a Bangalore student, can be jailed over tweet, toolkit for her support to climate justice, Prakash, and farmers' agitation, we all know. So, 3 cheers to you, sirs and madams. I feel, we all feel now a part of your college. So, and of course, all the speakers, today's speaker, Dr. Srilata and Dr. Prakash, and other speakers who might not be present today. I see Prasant Tambe, but Ravi Verma, Thomas Crawley, Asa Dorain, Ambika Ayadurai, Kenneth Nelson, Basudev Sunnani, and of course Malini and me. We all came from different backgrounds, countries, continents, different caste, class, themes, and regions. We spoke on land, water, animal, forestry, climate, urban development, city, waste, history, folklore, whatnot, culture, memory, feeling, experiences. Many themes actually appeared in our talks, and sometime brief question answer session. We are sorry about this because of the paucity of the time. I can only underline that seeing the richness and diversity of themes and speakers, that a new contemporary and historical archives can be built on environmental justice politics in India. We can connect many of these themes the way today Prakash and Srilata and then Malini try to do it. We can fuse many things to develop our understanding on caste, Dalits, and environmental justice politics in our country. Another very briefly important point that we know environmental justice can have diverse meaning, diverse vantage point. We all know that how environmental and social justice issues intersects with each other. We know how human rights movement, workers movement, environmental movements have many points of overlap. But as the title says, this anti-caste, and I'm thankful to Malini, because when we were trying to coin the broad thematic axis, then Malini suggested this anti-caste. We consciously kept caste as a larger framework to present the environmental injustices that keep Dalit and lower caste deprived of the natural resources. And how are they deprived? And the Prakash visuals today was really, once again disturbing. This also explains, and this should all remind us that why concepts of justice and politics alone are no longer sufficient to explain the environmentalism of the marginal, and that's why we need to bring caste here. We also know environmental justice as the distributive justice, issues of inequality, access, all these things are crucial in importance here. But what I would like to just quickly underline here that came out from this series time and again, the issue of recognition. Recognition of different experiences, feelings, symbols in the social, cultural, and political realms in the context of caste and Dalit ecological world. If you remember today, Dr. Vasudev Sunani, the Dr. Goldie George, or Ambika Ayadurei, or Asa Doren, all four speakers reminded us towards recognition and respect as very strong elements of environmental justice. So how do we recognize different voices, different images, different symbols, the experiences, and so on and so forth? So many things we have seen the way when we heard Kenneth cast in New Land Wars in India, and when we heard Prasant Tambe, who is present there, the organized state-sponsored exclusion of Dalits in Indian forestry also showed us the new dynamics of power and privilege and caste in the contemporary India. At the end, I can certainly say that with this anti-caste environmental justice discourse, this has certainly the potential of to bring new players in the environmental politics, and that's why we could gather some entirely new speakers. Prasant Tabe, Goldie George, all these came into focus through our series. New set of issues to which environmental justice framework could be applied. Look, the other point is that this framework does not only refer to action that have an unequal or unjust or casteist intent. What we have also learned, the politics of environmental justice also include actions that have a dominating, subjugating casteist influence and impact. How do we create dominant environmental knowledge? Consciously, unconsciously, covertly, overtly, what do we constitute and accept as environmental knowledge or identity or value? So they all also came into question through this series, and that's the search for new Dalit ecologies have tremendous importance in our anti-caste ecological politics in India. So thank you very much to all of you, to the college, and hope we will also work together in future. Thank you.